to the waiting room. For those that have made it, I want to welcome you to a session to celebrate Confronting Peace, local peace building in the wake of a national peace agreement. Thank you so much. So great to see people from different parts of my life joining here, and authors from the book, co-editors on the volume, and others who we've talked to about this work. We've got also a discussant who's joined us. Thank you. Maria Lucia Zapata will be making some concluding remarks today. But without further ado, I want to thank you all for coming, and we'll start with some very, very brief presentations. I've asked everyone to stick to just 4 minutes. And so we will hear first from Dr. Christopher Mitchell. Over to you, Chris.
All right, have I only really got 4 minutes? Okay, I'll talk very quickly. I guess the first thing to say about the book is that it is actually the 4th book in a series. The series sort of looks something like this. And you'll notice that, in fact, it certainly doesn't look like a series because all of the books were published by a different publisher. And indeed, it was never a planned series. The series sort of grew organically out of what we have done previously. And as I say, this is the 4th in what turned out to be a series. I think the starting point of the series, oddly enough, began over 30 years ago when 2 colleagues and I were on a field trip to Armenia, and we were actually up near the international border with Azerbaijan in one of the sort of interludes of the fighting that went on over Nagorno-Karabakh in the 1990s. And while we were there, the local mayor, a very impressive lady, asked if we had any advice about how we would create a neutral zone or a peace corridor along what had become the international boundary, which a couple of years previously had been a sort of internal boundary in the Soviet Union. And she said, you know, this is ridiculous because the people on the other side of the boundary I know very well. They're colleagues of mine. I'm good friends with the mayor in the town over there. You know, what can we do to set up something which is peaceful? I'm not sure we were able to give her much good advice. But when we got back, Dennis Sandoli and I sort of put our heads together. And we had this graduate student who was working on her PhD at the time, and we decided that we would dump on her the task of organizing a conference, which Susan Julie did in, I think, 1966. We pulled together a whole series of people who knew things about, for example, how did the Ledra Palace Hotel on Cyprus become a small peace zone? How did the peace zone in the Congo, known as the Riki zone, come into being? And there were a whole series of other examples of kinds of peace communities, peace zones, peace corridors. We finished up, I think, that with a journal issue, and then Landon Hancock and I started to work together on the first of what turned out to be a series, and it was this one. It was called Zones of Peace, and at the same time we were being inundated with a flood of very talented students from Latin America who particularly wanted to do something about peace communities in Colombia. And so that's partly what this first book is about. It's about, if you have to sum it up in a word, it's about sanctuary. How do you actually produce sanctuaries? We finished that one in 2007, I think, Landon, somewhere around there. And then it occurred to us that we hadn't really sort of mentioned anything at all about the linkages between the peace communities locally, rural communities, and what was going on nationally. There must have been some linkages. So we put our heads together, and by this time, many of our authors in the first book had become respectable members of academia, underpaid assistant professors, and they contributed to this one, which is the second in the series. It's called Local Peace Building and National Peace. That came out in 2012. At that point, I think Landon and I again recognized that if there was one thing that was really sort of needing a serious look at, it was the whole issue about, about the question of legitimacy. How did people achieve legitimacy in the middle of a civil war among local communities? And so this one is the third one, Local Peace Building and Legitimacy. We did that, I think we finished that in 2018. And the next obvious thing was, okay, well, what happens to these local peace communities in the Philippines, in Colombia, in Sri Lanka? What happens when peace actually breaks out? How do they cope with the country being allegedly at least at peace? And then we realized, well, this was happening before our very eyes, because in 2016, at the end of 2016, peace broke out in Colombia. It was only a partial peace, but it was a deal signed between the Colombian government and the guerrillas that have been fighting the Colombian government since the 1950s. So it was a historic event. So we had an opportunity to look at these processes that were happening from 2016, when the peace deal was signed, and what effect that was having at some of the local communities that people such as Camilo and Cecile and Mery knew about from work that they'd been doing down there. So the question was, how were they faring in the peace? And that's what this book is about. And that's why, incidentally, about half the book is about what's happening in Colombia, and why most of the chapters actually focus on places like Samaniego or Policarpo or small rural communities in Colombia. The rest of the book is about, we're very fortunate that my old colleague, Paul van Tongeren, had written a very long piece about peace communities in Africa. So that's in there as well. Wendy and Meg wrote about what was happening in Mindanao, and I hope that we're going to hear some details about their work and their knowledge about communities that have attempted to cope with peace. 4 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris. That's a great introduction to what brought us here today with this book. We turn next to Mery Rodriguez to speak about Magdalena Medio. And Mery, if you could, I forgot at the beginning to say the Peace Week coordinators are going to make videos of each of the sessions. And so that's why we're recording. If you could each introduce yourself before you start speaking, that will help them with their video editing. So Mery, over to you, if you could start with saying who you are and what you represent before you go into the chapter. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Mery Rodriguez. I belong to the Observatorio para la Paz in Bogota, Colombia, and I am a proud ICAR alumni today, Carter School. I want to share with you for 4 minutes, I hope, the chapter I co-authored with Fernando Sarmiento. Fernando is the national coordinator for the peace and development programs in Colombia. And we entitled our chapter Bridges, Paths, or Crossroads, the Magdalena Medio Development and Peace Program before and after the Havana Accord. So very briefly, I want to share with you that the Magdalena Medio region in Colombia is one of these blessed and coarse places in our country because it is an oil-rich region. It borders with the Magdalena River, which is the main river in the country and allows all things to happen, good and bad. It's rich in the soil is very rich, so agriculturally it can produce anything that it wants. And it has the main city is Barranca Bermeja, and it's the city where all the oil processing happens, the refinery and all that. And around those areas is the rural areas are agriculturally, the tradition is agricultural and campesino culture. It has had, through the 50 something, almost 60 years of the Colombian conflict, it has the presence of all armed actors, both legal and illegal, and in different moments of its history, at different moments of its history, which has, given this region one of the highest numbers and percentages of victims in the whole country. The programs for development and peace were born in the Magdalena Medio. The first one actually happened there in 1996, and it in part started because of the question of how is it that we have such a rich region and more than half of the people are living either in poverty or below the poverty line. So what is it that is happening here? And with that question, they started to look and talk about what is it that needed to be done. And the question was, how do we actually do both peace and development? Because we cannot talk about peace with hunger, and how do we actually go about it? So the PDPs work on collaborative work, citizens governance, human rights defense, and local peace building. And for 25 years have been doing so. In terms of the Havana Accord, the Magdalena Medio region had assigned a PEDET. It has one of the PEDETs, which are the programs for development and territorial peace, and development of territorial peace. This region, the accord was based on the territorial peace concept, which sounds like the Havana Accord discovered, but really has been worked in the region in the country for 20 something years or more. And the PEDET for the Southern Bolivar is called the Southern Bolivar PEDET, which has only 7 municipalities of the entire region, which is 32. And we started looking at this and what happens if you have all the concentrated resources, institutional resources, money resources, technical resources, in only 7 municipalities out of the 32 that are a region. And these programs of development and peace have worked with the 32 municipalities. So what we saw, it's a huge effort to actually make the territorial peace happen, but somehow there is a break on the way in which this can be done, because 25 of the other 25 are not participating. So the programs for peace building are being broken in this region a little bit because of the exclusion of the other 7. So what we and then let me finish with this remark. The idea of doing participatory peace building with the Havana Accord was that people were going to participate in all the implementation. And what has happened is that people have been consulted. What do you want and how do you want it? But that's it. It is not real participation with their knowledge, their capacity. They have been working for 30 years in building capacity for governance, for citizens work, for peace building work. They have lots of technical knowledge in what they need and how they need it, but they were just consulted and then their participation stopped there. So I just want to say there is still time. There's 10 years more for the implementation, at least for the government to keep implementing the process. And maybe we need to rethink this territorial piece a little bit.
Thank you so much, Mery. Appreciate it. We now turn to Noah Rosen. Noah, if we can turn to you and please introduce yourself before you start speaking.
My name is Noah Rosen. I'm a PhD candidate at American University. I'm doing my dissertation research on the peace process in Colombia, the local impacts of the peace process in Colombia, in Chocó, which is the department that I also did this co-author paper with. So let me then seamlessly transition into that. Along with my co-authors, we started with the research question: how did the signing of the 2016 peace agreement in Colombia and then the subsequent withdrawal of the FARC affect these territorially based social movements in Chocó? So we found that although the peace agreement completed one of the key objectives of this movement, rather than a demobilizing effect on the movement, it rather revamped or reinitiated the movement. So our chapter kind of investigates why and how this happened. So to offer a little bit more context, Chocó is a department in the Colombian Pacific region. It's about 95% ethnic peoples, so that's indigenous and Afro-Colombian people. It's one of the poorest parts of Colombia, and it is also one of the worst hit by the conflict. It's also been a place of robust social movements for peace, which makes it a really interesting, fascinating laboratory to understand and investigate how those movements have transitioned into this kind of post-peace deal era. So with the peace agreement, what we saw was a real moment of hope and optimism in Chocó, matched with real improvements in the security conditions. And that in those first 6 months to a year, people for the first time could go back to their fincas, could go fishing after dark, etc. But at the same time, ethnic authorities were warning the government that if they were unable to replace FARC governance, that those same kind of structural drivers that attracted the FARC in the first place, the natural resources of Chocó, which include gold and also very valuable drug trafficking networks and trails up into Panama, were still there and would attract new armed groups. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. With the failure of the government to robustly replace FARC governance, rapidly the ELN guerrillas and the AGC paramilitaries entered into a full-scale conflict that has continued to this day to control these former FARC territories. The response from the ethnic groups has been to develop a territorial peace platform called the Acuerdo Humanitario Ya, or the Humanitarian Accord Now for Chocó, which is a peace platform that makes a series of demands for the armed groups to immediately demobilize, to negotiate with the government, for the government to negotiate with the armed groups as well, and for all parties to the conflict to respect the autonomy and life of the indigenous peoples and Afro-Colombian peoples living there. And with that kind of platform, they were able to insert themselves into the ELN negotiations with the government that unfortunately collapsed in early 2019, I believe. So our analysis really jumps into how exactly were these movements able to sustain mobilization after the termination of one of their biggest goals, which is a comprehensive peace deal with the FARC. And we found three explanations. The first being an expanding political opportunity structure with the Acuerdo de Paz, with new opportunities to place allies inside the government and also new opportunities to build bridges with international actors. Second, the incentives were still there, in the sense that with the FARC demobilization, there was this imminent and present threat of ELN guerrillas and AGC paramilitaries in conflict that demanded a social movement response. The third is, and maybe the most important, is about the capacity of these movements themselves. These are deeply experienced and well-organized ethnic movements who mobilize based out of their ethno-territorial political forms, the consejos comunitarios and the cabildos for the resguardos, that generate real legitimacy and interconnection among the movements. There's also a strongly integrated vertical structure with the platform, with the department level platforms. And finally, there's significant previous experience dealing with conflict that allowed these activists to anticipate the likely impacts of peace. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rene. We now turn to Cecile Mulligan to speak about Samaniego. And please introduce yourself, Cecile.
Thank you very much, Susan. Can you hear me well? Okay, perfect. So I'm Cecile Mulligan, one of the co-authors of the chapter entitled Samaniego after the 2016 peace agreement between hope and fear, together with my colleague Karen Bustos. So I'm one of the editors of the book, and I'm a professor at Flaxo, Ecuador. So our findings draw on years of research in this Colombian municipality, mainly on 2 field trips conducted in 2017 and 2019, during which we conducted interviews with a broad range of stakeholders. We also used secondary sources such as media reports to complement this data. And in the chapter, we discuss 3 main findings. The first one is that the peace agreement created opportunities for local peace building initiatives, among which we stress the reactivation of the Municipal Peace Council in Samaniego, the establishment of the Museum of Memory, and the creation of both a Municipal Peace Office and a Municipal Women Council. These initiatives, along with others, have sought to enhance citizens' participation in the peace building process at the local level, generate awareness about human rights violations committed during the armed conflict to avoid their repetition, disseminate information about the content of the 2016 peace agreement, and enhance women's participation in peace building. The second main finding has to do with the relations among Samaniego inhabitants, relations between residents and the state, and between the community and former combatants. We found that residents try to leave their political differences aside and unite around peace. However, their relations with the state remain strained. They continue to perceive their abandonment by the state, a deep mistrust in state security forces. Relations with former combatants were reportedly good in many rural areas where locals had lived close to the guerrillas, but not so in the urban center, where former combatants had to maintain a low profile for fear, especially after a series of assassinations in the municipality in 2018. The third main finding has to do with the significant increase in violence in the municipality since 2018. When we finished writing this chapter in 2019, 3 social leaders had been assassinated and many others were at threat, which compelled civil society leaders to maintain a low profile. Additionally, after the FARC demobilized, illegal armed groups related to drug trafficking started to fight over the control of the territory with the ELN, the main guerrillas still present in the municipality. This provoked sporadic armed confrontations. Many interviewees considered drug trafficking as the main cause of today's problem of violence in Samaniego. All in all, we conclude that even if the signing of partial peace agreements generates opportunities for local peace building initiatives, which is proper to so-called post-conflict contexts, the incomplete transition from violent conflict to peace in Samaniego required the continuation of activities for the protection of civilians and in support of peace negotiations with remaining armed groups such as the ELN. And as a result, our findings call for more distinction between contexts of partial peace agreements and full ones, both in academia and policy making. They also suggest that in context of partial peace agreements, like this case, we should talk of post-agreement rather than post-conflict. Likewise, the case of Samaniego calls for more attention to security issues in places affected by armed conflict and drug trafficking, so that local communities can truly reap the benefits of peace agreements.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Cecile. Then we move next to Policarpa. Camilo Pardo Herrera, I'll ask you to introduce yourself and speak to the chapter that you authored.
Great. Thank you, Susan. So my name is Camilo Pardo. I co-wrote The Illusion of Peace, Rural Colombia and the Post-Agreement, the case of Policarpa, with my colleague Raquel Victorino. So the essence of the chapter was that the signing of the agreement and the demobilization of FARC was a great chance to experience the transition from a state of illegal governance exercised by FARC to a state of formal governance that was or should have been enforced by the government. Our idea was to analyze the transition, the institutional transition in 3 dimensions. First, cultural, and look at the new rules that promoted and enabled the emergence of female leaderships in the municipality. Second, we looked at the economic institutions and look at the challenges posed by the transition from a fully planned economy based mainly on coca cultivation and cocaine production and controlled by FARC to one based on the rules of a free market economy. And third, transition in political institutions and look at how territorial control on the hands of FARC and the monopoly over the use of violence would transit back into the control of the Colombian state. This shift in institutions was visible for a couple of years. But then after the implementation of the agreements stagnated, the municipality experienced a regression into a situation of state absence, and again, the prevalence of illegal governance. This is what our research found. So in terms of cultural institutions and the emergence of female leaderships, we saw, for example, the implementation of two strategies, very interesting: Women's Political Leadership Program and the Gender School. Like I said, these leaderships were looking for social space that had been traditionally dominated first by males, essentially, and then by male FARC members during their rule. So these couple of institutions were pushing female leaderships. And as a result of these, women in the municipality were able to get together and form the Policarpa Gender Board, a civil society organization that advocated for women and other minorities' rights, and whose influence reached such levels that they wrote the municipal gender and LGBTQ public policy for Policarpa. Also, as part of this process, two of their members were elected to the municipal council in the local elections of 2019, ending an all-male composition in the municipal council since 1972. So very important transformations there. Second, in terms of the change in economic institutions, we saw how difficult it is to market legal crops in contrast to coca leaves, which enjoy permanent demand, stable prices, door-to-door purchases, communal technical assistance and technology development. This is a crop that doesn't need much water or much care, and it provides at least 6 harvests per year, when not 6. In contrast with, for example, coffee, which requires public infrastructure, access to markets, drainage systems, private technical assistance, technology development, and it gives only 1 harvest a year, and prices are not stable. But still, in spite of these challenges, given the institutions that were put forward by the agreement, and because the peace of mind that living in legality provides, a lot of people in the municipality, at least in the initial months, started to make the switch from coca cultivation to legal crops. And then finally, in terms of political institutions and the control of territory, after the demobilization of FARC, we saw, for example, the presence of government institutions and the international community and international community agencies that had never been seen before in a municipality. For example, the Land Restitution Unit started implementing the land restitution policy there. National Land Agency came in and formalized property titles to land, and the Agency for Restitution for Territorial Reconstruction also started implementation policies in the municipality. An army brigade was relocated in the municipality, and as a big change in contrast to past events, Policarpa saw peaceful presidential elections in 2018, the first of such in many years. So all of this took place after the demobilization of FARC in 2016, and in between around 2017 and 2019. In essence, Policarpa experienced a slow but progressive emergence of new institutions designed by the Peace Accord, and we saw those institutions to start giving fruit. But then after the cameras left and the municipality experienced an unexpected stagnation in the implementation of the agreements, for example, the Policarpa Gender Board lost force and no longer enjoyed the support from local, regional, or national governments. a lot of people went back to growing coca leaves. And then sadly, other illegal groups such as the ELN and the Colombian Gaitanist Self-Defense are now controlling the territory that was left behind by FARC combatants. In essence, what we saw is that Policarpa today is again under a state of illegal governance, but worse than before, in the sense that, as one community member put it, one of our interviewees put it, we felt what peace felt like for a couple of years, which makes going back even harder.
Thank you, Camilo, and appreciate your presentation. I want to move now to Rene Claude Nyonkoro. If you could turn on your video and unmute yourself, and Rene Claude, if you could please introduce yourself as you begin your presentation.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me. Not sure always, because sometimes we have very serious internet connection issues. My name is Rene Claude Nyonkoro. I'm a PhD candidate at Université Catholique de Louvain, it's in Belgium. And I'm working on a research project questioning the international policy prescriptions. And I mentioned this because it's one of the key reasons for which I also try to reflect on international driven peace building in the context of Burundi with my colleague Reginas. I commend him for his great collaboration. And the dynamics, the issues we talked about in the chapter come also from a long period of our own professional experience, either working as researchers or peace and human rights activists in different organizations in Burundi. And of course, as many know it as well, it's not so easy to talk about Burundi and all the challenges to peace, human rights in 4 minutes. I'm not even sure if it could be possible within 4 hours. So, and I used to ask people I've met for so many occasions across the world, whether they know where Burundi is. It's not in Latin America, it's in Africa, East Africa currently. Asking them whether some of them have visited Burundi. I haven't met many people who have been here, but at least for this particular session, I'm lucky there is Cecile who has lived and worked in Burundi, and more importantly, not in the capital city. So if I'm wrong in a point or another, Cecile will be there to help, as well as Reginas if he's listening. The background for this particular chapter and the peace building work in this context of Burundi, unfortunately, we have had the years our own hotspot for conflicts involving ethnicity, history of violence, being political, social, the use of and legitimization of political violence. We have seen this in the country with different military coup d'etat. It's a country which has always been suffering from election stress, because most of the time elections in the country have been followed by violence at a high level, with president being killed and massacres at a large scale in the community. Whenever also we talk about conflict violence, there are other ways that play a big role as killers to look at issues, poverty. We are a poor country. And of course, we are in a region where the worst has happened in terms of conflicts. We have Rwanda in the north. You know what has happened there back to 1994, genocide. And of course, there is the eastern part of Congo, which is also another hotspot around Burundi. So within this context, there have been so many efforts to tackle the conflict, but also to work on a sustainable peace, being both at international, national, and the local level. And at the national level, we have had a peace agreement back to 2000. This was in August, with a comprehensive peace agreement, what is referred to as the Arusha Peace Agreement. which mostly sets the background for power sharing among the different segments, ethnic segment of the society, without, however, responding to key peace and human rights issues at the community level. So this is what we tried to look at, because under this national framework, with all these efforts aimed at ending the conflict, there has also been so many initiatives at the community level, mainly led by NGOs, many of them trying to bring together divided communities, trying to set up inclusive association for self-promotion, just using them as a framework for dialogue, work, and reconciliation. There has even been some creativity calling into action some cultural, social cultural activities to just help to bring together people. Other initiatives were mainly oriented towards capacity building for local community members. And you know how it is most of the time frame. It can be training, conflict resolution. It can be about supporting some key categories who have been involved most in the war, from ex-combatants, displaced people, while many other initiatives were mainly oriented towards trauma healing, support for victims of torture, sexual violence, and so on. So in our article, we really take all these initiatives for what they value, but especially when you look at the local peace committees, which were our own focus, we look at them as hybrid structures, mostly inspired by peace practice from abroad, even though they also bring into action, call into action some local norms, some local references, structures, the practice of peace. For example, many of them were working with the traditional institution called Bushinganai, these elder people who are there to settle community conflict. The local peace committee also reflects, this has also been seen in other contexts, the power balance between those who brought inputs, this can be international, national NGOs, and those who deliver outputs at the community level. It can be about money, it can be about many things. But when you look at this from a long-time perspective, you see how either individuals themselves have evolved or structures. We've moved from peace-loving minds to political brokers. I remember Gina's talking about this. Many of them, when they started, they had just a short-term outlook of the issues. We see many of them also self-branding themselves as apolitical, but they are not seen as apolitical as such. And there is a great challenge for them to adapt to a new, the changing context, both in the language and the practice of peace and peace building. What understanding do they have of peace building, instead of just this kind of fixed understanding or a ready-made construction, that rather than something which is dynamic. It's also, there are also so many issues associated with who bring them, what are their motivations? Many of them, yeah, they have been doing some community-driven work built on the community demands for peace, but it's also important to highlight that many of them are still working on donor-driven demands, are relying on the experts from abroad, which brings a lot of challenges, especially in a context where there are tensions, growing tensions between the government at the national level, the international actors, especially these international NGOs, and the local actors in the community. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And you're right, we really do need 4 hours because I know that was too short. But I also am excited for the conversation we'll have. We do have a few more presentations. We'll turn now to Wendy Craker. I'll ask you to introduce yourself, and if you could please limit yourself to 4 minutes. Thank you.
Yes. Thanks, Susan. Welcome, everyone. Special welcome to those from the Philippines who are foregoing sleep in order to be here. Thank you. I'm Associate Professor in Peace and Conflict Transformation Studies at Canadian Mennonite University. I will be summarizing the chapter Constant Motion, Multidimensional Peace Building for Peace Processes. And I wrote this chapter together with Philippine peace builder Myla Leguro from Catholic Relief Services, an on-the-ground person from Mindanao. So the question, how did communities move forward once the ink has dried on the peace agreement? The contested spaces between the experiences of violence and ensuing peace agreements can be vast, as you know. And communities emerge from this conflict internally divided by multiple fault lines. Research has surfaced indicating that sustainable peace is greatly enhanced by an inclusive process that opens space for multiple peace building entry points. So our chapter examines some Mindanao challenges following the 2018 peace agreement in regard to the very local realities of living within what was negotiated. And our case study focuses on the emergence of the Christians for Peace movement, or the CPFM. So war, the struggle for colonial imperial domination, the pushing of identities and boundaries are entrenched within the Mindanao story that involves indigenous peoples, Muslims, and settlers. Calls for justice, attention to root causes, the right to self-determination, for basic needs to be met are all at the heart of peace building work in this region. Thus, the Philippine context holds great potential for observing peace building methodologies and how inclusive peace is done. To the case study, Christian leaders observed that the perspectives of minority Christian communities seem less visible and unarticulated at the local and national levels in comparison to their fellow Muslim citizens in the region. This concern served as the initial motivation for key individuals from Christian leaders in Cotabato City to jointly hold listening opportunities for Christian settler communities. The aim was to advocate for some inclusive peace processes through what they called the 17-point Peace and Development Agenda for the Bangsamoro Peace Process, and to jointly create, as both Christian and Muslim leaders, a manifesto of joint cooperation. It emerged from a high-level meeting held with leaders of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, MILF, and the Moro National Liberation Front, MNLF, in September 2018. We as authors used the Philippine-developed 3B framework to analyze, to understand this work of the CFPM, a three-step reconciliation and conflict transformation process. And the framework provides a basis for understanding the workings of inclusive peace building in Mindanao. The 3Bs are binding, bonding, and bridging. Binding focuses on personal change and trauma healing. Bonding is aimed at building internal group cohesion with respective or single identity groups, preparing them then for constructive dialogue, engagement, and collaboration with other groups. And then the bridging works on making these connections across groups to build trust and positive relations. The manifesto signing event indicated the solid presence of the relationships required for developing a vertical peace. The combination here of both horizontal and vertical relationship building is a crucial dimension of Mindanao peace building efforts over the decades. The conveners of the CFPM worked diligently to be part of constructive developments during this challenging transition to peace in a region that has seen so many decades of war. The investment of embedded Mindanaoan peace builders into the emergent space following the peace agreement uncertainty was enabled through decades of honing peace instincts and relationship building. Utilizing the 3B framework, the CFPM spent considerable energies engaging in both bonding and bridging dialogues within their constituency and beyond. This enabled the manifesto and showcases the constant motion of energy and nimbleness needed to produce effectiveness. These skill sets hold a delicate balance between relational and structural attention, and they support ongoing relationships of trust, giving peace a chance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wendy. And appreciate you sticking to the time limit too. Appreciate that. Megumi Kakawa, we now turn to you. Meg, if you would speak about the Bangsamoro process, and please start by introducing yourself. 4 minutes, please.
Hi, my name is Meg Kakawa. I'm also the ICA alumni, and I'm also, as ICA teachers, I'm also a practitioner and also the academic at the same time. And I work in the government side, UN side, and right now I'm working with a rebel. So this research was collected the data from the inside rebel community. Historically, the Philippine government inherited the American colonial development policy, which is in the 1960s ancestral mass, accelerated mass Christian settlement and the marginalization of a Muslim in their ancestral domain. To defend each right, both communities have armed. In 1997, martial law, the majority of armed Christian settlers are merged into the Filipino government system, while the majority of armed Muslims were merged into the secessionist rebel groups, such as Moro National Liberation Front, MNLF, and the splitter, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, MILF. Then both Moro rebels have established rebel governance in the same region. The MNLF side already signed a peace agreement in 1996, and the Bangsamoro experienced the first transition in the early 20s. But this research focusing on the before and after the 2010 National Peace Agreement signed by the MLF. Before 1910's NPA, National Peace Agreement, the MILF, as a political military institution, had developed the inter-community negotiating power of MLF community to a point where they enjoy a relatively equal relationship with other local community, Christian, indigenous, or non-rebel Muslim, all of which enjoys some semi-legal power of governance, while the social rigidity remained as an obstacle to further community peace building. The arrangement did work, or at least mitigated the use of gun to settle dispute, but usually they are fighting all the time by gun. Unfortunately, the National Peace Agreement has been eviscerated before it was enacted, and the process of peace infiltration has become highly uneven. That subsequent organic law of 1918 did establish an autonomous regional government supported by some block grants, which provided better physical autonomy for rehabilitation and development. But at the same time, it has diluted many key details, especially local security and issue of ancestral domain. Given the term of the organic law, existing community peace initiative will face difficulty in maintaining any kinds of a systematic platform. Structurally, the political military governance system based on the patronage remains unchanged. Dismantling rebel forces will undermine the MLF's institutional capacity to defend both its own community and its local peace partner in inter-community peacemaking and a policy. This is likely to weaken by hybrid community peacebuilding platform. Further, the rivalry between the MNLF and MILF and how this has contributed to producing an uneven distributed peace dividend, and those help to weaken a moral community peace building effort. Worse still, local disappointment has enabled the violent and extremist rebel groups such as ISIS to expand their influence. Structurally, the organic law may have pushed the mass of the poor even deeper into poverty and insecurity. But in response, many rebels tirelessly sorted out the practical alternative suggested by hybrid peace building. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meg. Appreciate it. And now we turn to Landon Hancock. Ask you to introduce yourself, Landon, and present the concluding chapter, please.
Well, thank you, Susan. And thank you for organizing this. I know it was a heavy load to get all this together and get everybody here. My name is Landon Hancock. I'm a professor of peace studies at the School of Peace and Conflict Studies at Kent State University. Like Susan and others, I'm an ICAR Carter School alum, and I'm also Chris's partner in crime for the past 15 years. So he wasn't able to show you the all the covers. So I'm going to just go and throw this up briefly. And you can see that just overall, we've had, beginning with Chris and Susan back in 1997 to now, we've started just from a handful of people interested in local zones of peace and peace communities to a much larger epistemic community, moving from the idea of territorial to communal, from Philippines and Colombia to a global view, and looking at the varying relationships from anti-government to government-owned to zones and communities to LPCs and I4Ps. 4 volumes and counting. I'm sure we'll be having a meeting fairly soon about what we do next. And the other thing we really learned was that Routledge has terrible covers. That, we've managed to put together some nice covers in the past, but I have to say Routledge is probably one of the more disappointing ones. We learned about how covers have to make it on Amazon. So let me go ahead and stop that screen share. But I thought at least since Chris was holding them up and I had pictures, I would at least do the shameless book plug. So hang on one second here. The other thing to really note is Susan and I took the time to go through everyone's chapters and try and combine it with the learning that we've had over the past 15 to 20 years. We note that the nature of peace really has a specific meaning for these peace zones. That in fact, it's really a nominal kind of peace within the midst of a continuing conflict. Without fail, every single zone we've looked at, from Colombia to the Philippines to Africa, all of the peace zones that have existed when a conflict has had an agreement have had continuing levels of conflict. That the implementation of those agreements often has had a high level of focus, which can really be vastly contrasted with the grassroots experiences. So you might think of many of the peace zones as places where, they engaged in active neutrality and they engaged in local peace building because they were a no-go area or violence was endemic. And they were hopeful that there would be a lot of investment of resources. And depending on the amount of input by the national government, that could be, yes, we get a lot of resources, but maybe only for a short period of time while the television cameras are there. Other places, almost no resources at all, or other places, different kinds of resources. The attention span of your average politician seems to be fairly short. Some of the things we found in terms of implementation was that particularly in Colombia, the DDR process had a good start and poor follow through, and was largely uncoordinated in terms of trying to ensure particularly human security for ex-FARC members who wanted to participate politically, were guaranteed to participate politically, and whose lives were often under threat. IDP return required human security, both for former FARC members and for regular IDPs coming back. In Colombia, transitional justice was probably one of the best implemented portions of the peace accord, largely because the group running it wasn't as under the thumb of the national government. And this allowed them to forge more relationships with local communities and listen to them. As Cecile noted, you had a lot of instances, and I think Mery noted this as well, where the local communities had been highly organized, particularly running their peace communities, and wanted to be involved, and yet they were just consulted rather than coordinated with. And it was the transitional justice group that did a much better job, as opposed to the PDETs, the local peace building, and the PNIS, looking at crops changes, as Camilo mentioned. And so the economic impact had a lot of local attention, but little national support. And the relationships between the government and the periphery in these local zones have many of the same sort of pre-agreement tensions that remain between them. The locals overall lacked avenues for accountability. There was a lack of legitimacy for the national institutions. Local institutions had built up a lot of legitimacy, and without that coordination, that legitimacy did not automatically transfer upward. And one of the other things we did note on a positive is that a lot of the work that had been done by the peace communities in building up their social capital and building up their capacities and their organizing abilities was it by itself a peace building good that transferred to the post-conflict peace era, as it were, or the post-agreement, shall we say, peace era, that this organizing capacity once built was going to continue to be used in most cases. And that in itself is something that I think international peace building organizations need to look at in terms of what the UN calls sustainable peace building. If they want to develop that and support that, they should be supporting the kinds of interactions that we've seen in the peace zones. So I realize there's more time to be taken, but I think I'm going to leave it at that and turn it over to Susan and to comments from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Landon. And thank you to Maria Lucia Zapata, who's agreed to give some opening discussion comments, serve as our discussant today. We turn to you for some brief remarks, and then we'll open it up for discussion. Please introduce yourself before you begin.
Thank you, Susan. My name is Maria Lucia Zapata, and I am the chair of political science in Javeriana University in Bogota, Colombia. And thank you to the Carter Center. And it's very, very nice to see all the new friends in this space. So this book and this presentation answer to the questions of how can we move forward from the peace agreement. I am just quoting here Wendy, but I think it's an interesting question. Local peace building, fight in a good way, or how can we say, a struggle, and all the energy is putting towards not only non-violent approaches at the local level, but also hopefully to a peace agreement. So what happened when the peace agreement is reached? What happened when we obtain that threshold? So these papers all show us lessons learned, but also the obstacles that local peace building has to face. And what I found very interesting is also the recommendations that these experiences provide to us. It shows us the importance of platforms or relationships between different levels, not only at the local, but also national and international level. The importance of institutions. Yes, local peace building has a reach, but in order to continue as in the experience of Colombia, just to, after the mobilization, how to respond to the gap of these informal institutions, how to respond to the needs of the community, local peace building can provide some answers. I'd like to highlight this. Perhaps these experiences show us that communities are very realistic. They have the gift of what Lederach said in the moral imagination, and the gift of pessimism. They know that peace is not easy, that the signature of a peace agreement is not enough. And in my experience, also, they know the peace agreement is just one highlight in the dynamic of conflict. And in that sense, communities are prepared for eventualities that may happen. So yes, the peace agreement is important, but it's not the panacea. It's not going to give all the answers. And I believe this is the strength of local peace building, that the structures that they have, the platforms that they have built, have the power to respond to these weaknesses or challenges that will be during the implementation process. I just like to highlight that there are many similarities between the some of the experiences. In Philippines, in the case of the Philippines, I have always admired the way they adopted and adapted principles of conflict transformation, and they also give a step or provide also innovations, like adding the aspect of spiritual, the spiritual aspect, which is perhaps central in the conflict, but also to work in that area was important. So yeah, I just want to highlight that despite similarities, all of the experiences have important contributions. I have some questions that while I was listening to you guys, I've been thinking, perhaps from an academic point of view and contributing to the debates in local peace building and critical peace studies, what is the relation, or what is the relation of these initiatives with what we call liberal peace? Are these local initiatives contributing to traditional approaches to liberal peace, or these initiatives are contributing to a more emancipatory view of peace? Are we perhaps, after all these years, and I'm really glad that Professor Mitchell started showing all the evolution of these debates, and perhaps I was thinking, are we in the brink of some new, or not new, but are we contributing to a more emancipatory view of peace building? Also, another question is, all of the papers highlight that civil society are very robust, and that was something important for tackling or responding to the challenges of during implementation of the peace agreement. So how do we reach the robustness, if we can say? How can we contribute for a local, for civil society to be robust in order to have a strong local peace building? And also I found interesting, like, the importance of women and youth in these papers. Like, I highlight the importance of leadership. I don't know if there are other, comments that people would like to do around the leadership of women, or new approaches to leadership that need to be strengthened. So I think I will leave there because my 5 minutes are over.
Thank you. Very stimulating comments. And I think what I'd like to do, given we have limited time and a lot of people have just listened and listened and listened, I would love to collect other comments from people in the audience, and then I'll turn back to the panelists for kind of a 1-minute comment on one of the comments. So you can each be listening to, what Maria Lucia has just shared, and any other comments from members of the audience here. And then we'll give each of you a minute to reflect on one piece. Obviously, you won't be able to comment on everything, but choose the one that most relates to the area you've worked on. So if you could use the hand raise function, anyone who wants to get in on the conversation and make a brief reflection on what you've heard, ask any questions on particular areas. This is a time for yes, Jim Adams, let's turn to you very briefly, please. You need to unmute yourself. There we go.
Okay.
And if you would introduce yourself, everyone speaking, please introduce yourself before you speak.
Okay, my name is Jim Adams, one of the, I guess, graduated commandos of ICAR in the earlier days, now called Carter School. And it's good to see Susan again and Landon, long time no see. I spent a good number of years overseas in peacekeeping operations. Well, it used to be called peacekeeping. Now it's stabilization mostly. And working as a civilian in civil affairs and operations. I wanted to just comment that, Landon, I completely agree with your comment that much of the work that is done in conflict zones, from academia, from foundations and organizations supporting peace building generally, it's not necessarily obvious what happens there, but there is inevitably a transfusion of ideas and thoughts and support for different kinds of peace building efforts. And that whether it's done through the UN or other track one organizations and governments or NGOs, international NGOs, local NGOs, those contacts have effect. And it's usually, in my observation, by one individual at a time. And it makes a difference. It may not manifest for a number of years, a good number of years, but it is effective, and it makes a difference sooner or later.
Thank you,
That's all I
Jim.
would say.
Thank you. And I see Matthew Barra has put in the chat a question. In areas where local peace committees have been effective in advancing peace, what made it possible? So specifically the local peace committees, what makes that possible? I have a question. I'm not seeing any other hands, but I want to pose a question, which we alluded to in the beginning. What about next steps? What would be the next phase of this study? There have been so many different ways of looking at different aspects of zones of peace, local zones of peace. What would make sense to do next? What questions are exciting based on this conversation? So I'll pose that. Any other comments from audience before we turn to the panelists? Okay. Oh, we got, nope, Jim, you're waving.
Yeah, just one more thought is that in this regard of regards to what's next, in the context of the local or national work in a particular conflict zone or post-conflict zone, I think it's useful to think in terms of global context now, and that these, and to push the idea that the efforts that are being done in a particular location now apply sincerely, globally, in conflict zones elsewhere, and in lessons learned elsewhere, and in a particular spot. And that,
thank you.
Yeah, autocracy and democracy, there is a connection, and this work has significance.
Thank you. Yeah, the local global connections. All right, let's go to each of the panelists for a moment of reflection. Chris, let's start with you. And Chris Mitchell.
Am I unmuted? Can people hear me? Yeah, okay. All right, two comments that ring a kind of a bell with me. This whole business about what's the connection between what we've been doing and the so-called liberal peace. I mean, interestingly enough, that's come up in another group that the Carter School is pushing at the moment, called the Southwest Asia Group. You know, we're talking now about what do people mean by liberal peace. I think that what we're looking at here is a very, very different phenomenon from liberal peace. Liberal peace, you know, tends to be a top-down process. It tends to be sort of a one-size-fits-all process. You know, you go in there, you calm people down, you hold elections, you establish a legislature, you reform the judiciary, you try to reform the security services, and then you announce victory and you announce democracy is in place and you go home. You usually go home too quickly. And I think what we're looking at here is a phenomenon which is quite different from that. And I'm still not quite sure, even though Landon and I sort of did produce a book about it, what the relationship is between what goes on at the top level and what actually still goes on in many of these local communities. What's the connection? On the next steps thing, well, I have to tell you, I increasingly these days, I go back to Dennis Sandoli and I and Murad Muradian talking to this lady up in the border areas of Armenia, and she's asking us, can you give me some advice about establishing a neutral zone or a peace corridor in between, as a sort of a buffer zone between us and people we used to call neighbors. And we now find ourselves calling threats or enemies. Well, that seems to me that that's an interesting question to go back to. I mean, you know, what the hell is going on at the moment in Eastern Europe between the Ukraine and Russia? How can you actually think about the possibility of some kind of a new system in that part of the world? And I think one answer may be, let's think about a peace zone, which involves Ukrainians, Belarusians, Russians, which first of all reassures reasonable people in Moscow, and I think there still are some reasonable people in Moscow, that the threat from the West, which they're always worried about historically, is less, and which reassures the Ukrainians that whatever else happens, the chances of suddenly finding 150,000 Russian troops right bang up against your border gets less and less and less. I know some of our colleagues down in Georgia have been pushing for a while some kind of a peace zone. Well, let's think about peace zones as buffer zones or neutral zones or something like that. Maybe that's the next one, Susan.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, then we turn to Mery Rodriguez for one comment on one of these issues.
Sorry, I did too.
All right. This rich conversation, thank you so much for all what you have said and the very provocative questions. I think I would like to link three of them, because I think that what at least the regional peace initiatives that I have researched have in common is that the institutionalized way in which the national governments want to impose a way of doing this is what have harmed them the most. So I think that's a way of trying to impose liberal peace. And I think these regional peace initiatives are more into community and communal ways of finding the answers. And that includes economic issues. And that has to be dealt with. Peace processes that depend upon international money only to be implemented, or governments that change their platforms or their ideologies from the peace process, then just become weakened and weakened. So we need to think about international actors and cooperation in a different way. And it's not just giving the money through the institutions of the government that just, wants to keep a liberal peace idea. And one of the ways of doing that, and I think its next steps, has to do with really understanding the rich history of these places that, the peace process didn't invent things. They're just collecting from what has been done. And from that history, build what each one of them needs. So kind of change the idea of imposing a big model into everybody.
Thank you, Mery.
Sure.
Noah, any comments from you? One comment on one of the issues?
Sure, I'll absolutely keep it brief, Susan. Yeah, thank you all so much for having me in this extremely rich conversation. I wanted to comment on something that Maria Lucia was introducing, this idea of how do we strengthen civil society, or if we see civil society as such a key driver of local peace, what kind of assistance or strengthening can we provide to them? And I think what we've all seen in all of our cases is that the peace movements that we're looking for would be extremely hard to generate from the outside. They're all extremely rooted, and that's especially true, I think, of my case in Chocó. People are extremely rooted to territory and identity, and that's the real foundation of their peace movement. So obviously that would be hard for any kind of outside actor to generate. But there's still obvious ways to support them. And I think the most apparent is to continue putting pressure on the Colombian government to fully implement the peace deal. As Mery was saying, there's still time. And I think the peace deal is still a good deal. There's a lot there's a lot in there that has the opportunity to richly address the needs of communities. To offer two examples, one, as Mery was talking about in much more depth, the cadets have really have the mandate to radically transform rural Colombia, but are not being fully implemented. The other thing is that international organizations and international civil society, there's also plenty of opportunity to directly be funding movements. And to offer another example from the case that I was looking at, the Acuerdo Humanitario originally started as a peace negotiations platform. And when those negotiations collapsed with the ELN in 2019, the ethnic groups had to think about how to modify this platform to fit the new context. And so they generated lots of interesting programs around humanitarian monitoring and assistance that started to get off the ground, but ran out of funding and ran out of international support. So those are kind of the opportunities that I see to continue to support the movements that we're observing. So I'll close it with that.
Thank you, Noah. Now we turn to Cecile.
It's funny because I had really very similar thoughts like Noah and Mery, and I was thinking that one way forward or one interesting discussion now would be about how to enhance local peace building, especially given like the challenges that these local actors face with regard to national and international actors. And it would be really interesting if in our next phase, we would document other ways of doing peace buildings where local actors actually can define their own peace indicators, and local communities can take part in the planning, in the evaluation and monitoring of peace building initiatives that are supported by either the central state or international actors. And Landon is actually doing work on this, and it would be great if we can build on Landon's great work and maybe try to research more about what has been done in the field and what could be, some lessons learned, because this is another challenge that local communities confront when a peace agreement is signed.
Sorry, I tried to say thank you, Cecile, and then over to Camilo for one comment on one of these issues.
Thanks, Susan. So I'd like to refer to two things. So to the female leadership, what I think we saw during our research was that these institutions that came from the agreement and that were implemented in Policarpa did not really change anything drastically in the community. It seemed to me like everyone was just waiting there, and really the women of the municipality were really there waiting for a chance to get together, to organize, and to design and implement policies for themselves. We saw that what we describe in the chapter is a matter of 2 years, maybe even less. And we saw like 250 women getting together and conforming the women's board, electing a president. This woman who was, because of the context and everything, she was a very interesting case. She felt safe enough and secure enough to come out as a lesbian in a community that was very traditional, very conservative, that had lived under illegal governance for decades. So all of that was just there waiting for some sort of opening, from some sort of option just to become a reality. Right, that I thought the fact that these women got together and got elected 2 women for the municipal council after 50 years of male leadership, I think that was also very interesting. Yeah, and then in terms of next steps, one thing we found, and I think is really interesting, is the political economy of peace, right? We sort of think that everyone is for peace, everyone is for the transformations that peace brings with it. But But that's obviously not the case. A lot of people are used to the status quo and they benefit from the status quo, especially in such a long conflict as the one in Colombia. So they will be against these transformations that an agreement entails. And this goes beyond political parties. This goes beyond ideologies. It's just local interests that are affected by what is agreed on the negotiating table. I think that would be a nice way forward.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Now we move from the Colombia-focused discussions to Rene, Claude. If we could have one brief comment from you on one issue. If you're still here, we may have lost the connection. Oh, he's just rejoining in the waiting room, so we must have lost the connection. Let's go to Wendy Craker while Rene Claude is rejoining us. Wendy, over to you.
Thanks, Susan, and thanks everyone for a rich conversation. I'm going to pick up your point, Maria Lucia, about robustness of civil society. And I would say many would think, and I think it's true, there is a strong civil society in the Philippines. Yet when you add a new peace agreement in the context of decades of war and the agreement towards a new autonomous region, new fears emerge and shifting identities and loyalties that created uncertainties that weren't there in the same way prior to that peace agreement. The key thing we noticed for our chapter is that key leaders noticed that within their communities, there was dissension. And instead of rushing out to say, hey, here's the answer for it, they followed this 3B process, the binding process of doing their internal work first, meeting with their local communities to say, we need to get our act together if we're going to comment on anything. And then from there, we're able to engage with indigenous folks, Muslims in the region, to figure out larger pieces that they could do together. And for me, that being able to notice that there is not robustness and the courage to step into these contested spaces to say, we need to do something in our spaces, would lead me to a question of whether some analysis of peace leadership and vision might be also something to examine towards the next project. Thanks.
Thanks, Wendy. Thanks. Very interesting. Rene Claude, if you've come back, I think we lost the connection, but if you are here.
No, he got lost again. So he's not
lost
here.
again. Okay. Meg, let's turn to you. 1 minute.
Yeah, well, I may jump in the liberal peace building. It's in my paper also talk about the liberal peace building. My concern is the DDR. Because if the National Peace Agreement was deleted about the security matter, who's going to protect the rebel communities and also the Muslim community? Because most of the Christian side is more connected to the government side. So they will be like insecure. And then where the implementation of the National Peace Agreement were poor, I can hear from like a Colombia side too. Signatory of the National Peace Agreement will fall into the dilemma of power. So they will lose the question of legitimacy, I think, for the question that Landon talked about it. And then, so this is why I'm thinking about sustainable peace building. It should be more, as Mery and then Nora and Celine said, that institutionalization should be started from the bottom. I mean, whatever the work and in the local community, it can be make it as a rule, kind of rule, because of in case of the Philippine case, the rule of law is more law by ruler. So it's different. So if you, the whole entire country is like that condition, how are we gonna apply the liberal peace building? That's the question. So if in that case, it seemed to the Christian party, Russia and then Ukraine too, with the big man is playing in the not the rule of law as what we imagine. How we're gonna do is we have to build up for the community. And then for me, if it's maybe some people have the allergy with the rebels, but we also need to look at the how rebel can work and what they cannot work. And whatever it works, we have to bring up to the peace building for the sustainable peace building.
Thank you, Meg. Landon, let's turn to you.
Thank you. I'm going to just briefly try and answer Matthew's question in terms of the African LPCs. I think Rene's work shows quite clearly that there's an issue with legitimacy, that when the LPCs and other I4Ps are seen as disconnected from the government, they have a higher sense of legitimacy when they're more independent, but many of them require funding from government agencies, and that increases their dependency, particularly with the case in Burundi that he and his colleague illustrate, but also in the case of Ghana, where there's a real tension there between having some of that independence, legitimacy, but on the other hand, requiring funding every year from the Ghanaian government. Just trying to answer a little bit about Maria Lucia's question about liberal versus emancipatory. I think it's typically the zones of peace, the peace communities are emancipatory. And as Cecile has remarked, one of the real questions here, I mean, many of those zones operated with no funding, very little to no funding. And so when you get the funding and you get the accountability flows that go up to the national government and up to the internationals, that's where you end up with those crises of legitimacy and the pressures that come down. And so what I'm working on now is how to persuade international funders to understand that accountability needs to be mutual or accountability to the communities themselves. Unfortunately, my current work is hopefully bearing some fruit in that way, and at least getting the United Nations to look at mutual accountability systems, because they need to be accountable to their donors in ways that we didn't really understand. And also, they need what they call good data to show sustainable peace. And I'm arguing that sustainable peace really derives from the development of these kinds of civil society communities that zones of peace and peace communities develop because they need to in order to survive. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Landon. And now, Maria Lucia, if we can turn to you for any final comment, you get the last word here.
Well, that's such a responsibility, but I'm just listening to you guys. I'm just thinking that these papers and this work, that 20-year-old work, it leaves us with some promising paths that we should continue. I know, I mean, from being from Colombia, we know that the signature of the Peace Accord is not enough, and we have enormous challenges in the implementation. And in this sense, the experiences, the lessons, also the obstacles that local peace building face can give us important clues of how to respond. Of course, it's not the panacea, but it is an experience that shows us strength and creativity. And it's also that it breaks sometimes the boundaries of the liberal peace. So I think that the sky is the limit, and in this topic, and I am looking forward for the next volume in this series. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, on that note, I want to thank everyone for joining us for the Carter School's Peace Week. This is George Mason University's 50th birthday celebration. The university is now 50 years old. And this is our Peace Week, where we've had a series of events, and really, really grateful that you all joined for the focus on this book. Sorry about the technology difficulties occasionally here, but I think we got a really, really rich conversation, and I'm grateful for all your participation. And I look forward to next steps. It's exciting. I was quite sure I wanted to say never again with another book, but lots of good discussion. So very, very tempting. Oh, and I see Rene Claude has made it. So Rene, we're just at time, but if you're able to say hello and goodbye, We missed you when we were going around. Let's see if the connection's good enough. Maybe not. Okay, well,
sorry, it went down, and yeah, hope you're doing. It was very interesting to have. I had one comment of the on the question that came in the discussion, but I guess it's too late, huh?
I guess, well, it's the end, but if you want the very last word, we'll stay on 1 extra minute.
Yeah, it was just about, there was a question about what makes Peace Committee successful. I just speak from my own context. Those who survive and continue to do work, those who have managed to really work on strategic choices, especially addressing the root causes of conflict. I've seen also that those, especially who have built on rational successes, than pretending to influence the structural level, the national level. And lastly, I have also seen that some of the community, and this is really an unpopular opinion, especially for donors, my assumption and some evidence from the field suggests that local peace communities that survive and adapt are those which, those who were less exposed to external support, either in terms of ready-to-use one-size-fits-all tools and frameworks or funding. But again, I'm working on a comprehensive map of peace committee and they're working in the country. And maybe in the next volume, I will come up with some evidence from the field that can tell much about this. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you. And on that note, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. Wishing you the good rest of your day or your evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you.